The wind outside sounded like it wanted to peel the city open. It pushed against the glass of the tiny corner market until the door rattled, sending a thin blade of cold air across the tile floor every time someone forgot to pull it shut. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed, too bright for this late hour, too harsh for the kind of tired that clung to Mara's bones. Her breath left her lips in a faint cloud as she stepped inside, clutching her daughter tighter against her chest. Rosie's small fingers dug into the collar of Mara's worn coat, clutching an empty bottle like it was a lifeline. The little girl's dress, once a soft lilac, had faded to something between gray and memory. One sleeve was coming loose at the seam. Mara's coat hung on her frame like it had belonged to someone stronger once. Buttons didn't match, one pocket was torn, and the lining had come undone so badly that threads brushed against her wrist when she moved. Her dark hair was twisted into a low knot that had survived too many days without a mirror. No one looked at her. A teenager in headphones scanned energy drinks without lifting his eyes from his phone. A woman in scrubs held a carton of milk and stared blankly at the row of cereal boxes as if she'd forgotten why she'd come. The cashier tapped idly at his screen, lost in some video that made him smirk. Mara could have been a ghost. Sometimes it felt easier to be one. She moved down the aisle slowly, careful not to jostle Rosie too much. Her gaze drifted over canned soup, instant noodles, crackers, until it landed on the shelf that held the thing she'd been thinking about all afternoon. Baby formula. Bright tubs lined up like promises she couldn't afford. Her steps faltered. She stopped in front of the display and just stared. The price underneath each can was a number she already knew by heart. She'd counted the coins in her pocket so many times on the walk over that her fingertips still tingled with the shape of them. It wasn't even close. Rosie whimpered, a sound so soft anyone else would have missed it, but it sliced clean through Mara. She shifted her daughter to her other arm, whispering something soothing that her own heart didn't believe. Her mind spun in circles. If I walk out without it, she'll cry all night. She barely ate today. She's losing weight. I can see her ribs when I change her. If I take it and they catch me, will they call the police? Will someone decide I'm unfit? Will they say I'm dangerous, that I'm reckless, that I don't deserve to keep her? Would anyone even care why I did it? Or would I just be another line on a report? Woman, mid-20s, theft, probable vagrant. Her hand shook as she reached forward. She pulled one canister from the shelf, feeling the weight of it in her palm, imagining it as hours of peace. Full little size, the warmth of a fed child lying heavy against her chest. Her pulse pounded so loud it drowned out the hum of the lights. No one was watching. At least, that's what she told herself. The cashier still hadn't looked up. The woman in scrubs had moved on. The teenager was gone. Mara slid the canister under her coat, tucking it against her stomach. It was clumsy, obvious, the kind of move security cameras were made for. Her throat closed. She dipped her head, pressing her cheek to Rosie's hair, breathing in the faint smell of baby shampoo and cold air. Just today, she whispered, so quietly her lips barely moved. Just this once, my love. I'll fix it somehow. I promise. Promises were cheap. Formula was not. She turned toward the exit, forcing herself into a slow, practiced pace that she hoped looked normal. Every step felt like walking across thin ice. Her fingers tingled, her vision tunneled, the red exit sign above the door glowing like judgment. She was 3 strides away when a voice slipped through the space between heartbeats. You dropped something. Mara froze. Her feet, her lungs, the world. Everything stopped. Slowly, as if moving too fast might shatter what was left of her life, she turned. A man stood a few feet behind her. Early 30s, maybe. Dark hair pushed back from his forehead. A neatly trimmed beard. A charcoal coat that fit too well to be cheap. He held a canister of the same formula in his hand. His face wasn't hard. He wasn't scowling, wasn't disgusted, wasn't reaching for a phone. His eyes, steady, dark, strangely familiar, were filled with something that made her knees weaken. Not pity. Understanding. He extended the canister toward her. Let me take care of it, he said, voice calm and low, as if they weren't standing in the middle of a store with the world about to cave in. It's the least I can do. Mara opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Rosie's whimper rose into a thin cry. Without waiting for her answer, the man gave her a small nod, turned, and walked straight to the counter. And for the first time that night, Mara's fear stuttered, just enough to make room for confusion. He didn't hesitate. That was the part that unsettled her the most. Mara watched from a distance as the stranger set the formula on the counter, then reached back for another canister. He added diapers, wipes, a small pack of soft cookies that he probably knew Rosie was too young for, but that exhausted mothers sometimes needed more than sleep. The cashier finally tore his eyes from his phone, rang everything up, and announced the total. The man paid without flinching. No glance over his shoulder at her, no performative nod, no demand that anyone else notice what he was doing. He just accepted the bag, murmured a quiet thank you, and walked back toward her as if he'd simply done the most ordinary thing in the world. He held the bag out to her. "Here," he said gently, "for you and your little one." Her fingers hovered in the air before she could force herself to take it. I can't pay you back," she managed. Her voice sounded like someone else's, thin, frayed. His mouth curved into the smallest smile, one that didn't reach for attention but lived in the corners of his eyes. "No strings attached," he said. I promise." The wind howled when the door opened again, sending another shiver of cold through the store. Somewhere behind them, the scanner beeped. Life went on. But for Mara, time had snagged on this moment. He gestured toward the street. "There's a cafe around the corner that stays open late. It's warmer than standing out here. Come sit for a while. You both look like you could use it." Every instinct in her screamed to say no. Pride, shame, fear that kindness could turn ugly without warning. But Rosie's tired cry tugged at her heart, and her arms ached from holding her this long without rest. The sky outside was an ink-black sheet, the wind sharper now, and the car where they'd been sleeping felt impossibly far away. Her lips parted. "Just for a little while," she murmured. It was more to herself than to him. He nodded as if that settled it. "Just for a little while," he agreed. "I'm Caleb, by the way." The name hit her like a faint echo, stirring something in the back of her mind she couldn't quite place. She swallowed. "Mara," she said quietly. "This is Rosie." "Hi, Rosie," he said softly, lifting 2 fingers in a little wave that somehow didn't feel childish or patronizing. Rosie stared at him with wide eyes and hiccuping breaths, then relaxed her grip on the empty bottle just enough to let out a tiny sigh. The cafe was only 2 blocks away, its windows glowing gold against the dark like a lantern someone had forgotten to put out. When Caleb held the door open, the bell above it chimed, and warmth wrapped around them, smelling of espresso, cinnamon, and baked bread. For a second, Mara just stood there, rooted to the threshold. Something about the place, the wooden counter, the mismatched chairs, the gentle hum of music, pulled a memory she'd buried deep. Her vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sudden, aching familiarity of it. Years ago, this used to be her kind of place. Back then, the rain had been lighter, kinder. The morning rush meant laughter and names she knew by heart. She'd worn an apron that smelled like coffee and cream, her hair pulled back in a neat knot, ready to start another shift. She hadn't had much, but she'd had enough. Enough hope to share. Enough warmth to spare. She remembered the bell over a different cafe door, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of soft music that wrapped around frayed souls. She remembered the boy who had walked in, drenched and shaking, his hoodie dripping onto the floor, shoulders slumped as if the world had climbed onto his back and never gotten off. He'd patted his pockets, searching for a wallet he already knew he didn't have. "I'm so sorry," he'd said, voice tight with embarrassment. "I thought I had my... Never mind, forget it." She'd made the coffee anyway. 1 medium cappuccino, extra foam, a dusting of cinnamon because he looked like he needed something gentle. When she slid it toward him, she tucked a folded square of paper underneath the cup. "It happens," she'd said, "to all of us." He'd looked at her like she'd just thrown him a lifeline. When he unfolded the note at a corner table, his hands had trembled. 4 words, written in her hurried script as she'd moved between customers. Better days are coming. He'd stayed there a long time, both hands wrapped around the cup, eyes occasionally lifting to where she worked, laughing with regulars, cleaning the counter, offering little pieces of kindness without expecting anything in return. Back then, she never imagined she'd be the one drowning, clutching a child and a stolen can of formula in a city that felt colder every day. Standing in the warmth of the cafe with Caleb now, Mara had no idea that the boy from that rainy morning had grown up into this man, and that the worn scrap of paper from her past was still in his wallet, just waiting for the right moment to find its way back to her. They chose a table in the back, near a window streaked with rain. Outside, traffic lights smeared into soft red and green smudges on the wet pavement. Inside, everything felt slowed down, like the world had turned the volume down just enough to let tired hearts breathe. Caleb set the paper bag on the table and didn't rush to fill the silence. He ordered tea for her and hot chocolate for himself, but when it came, he didn't push either drink toward her. He let them sit, steam curling into the air between them like a fragile offering. Mara kept her gaze fixed on Rosie, who was finally starting to relax, her lids heavy, her mouth loosening around the bottle now filled with formula. The first swallow she took felt like a knife in Mara's chest. Relief and shame tangled so tightly she couldn't tell one from the other. She could feel Caleb watching her, but not in the way she was used to. Not like security guards at gas stations, not like drivers at stoplights who glanced at the car where she and Rosie slept. His gaze felt quieter, like he was looking at someone he was trying to remember, not someone he was trying to size up. He reached into his wallet. The motion was slow, almost reverent. He slid out something that had clearly been there a long time, a small card, edges softened by years of being carried around. He set it gently on the table between them. "This belongs to you," he said. Mara frowned, confused. Her eyes dropped to the card, and the world tilted. The handwriting was messier now, the ink a little faded, the paper creased, but the words were unmistakable because they were hers. She'd written them standing behind another counter, in another life, with steady hands and a heart that still believed in simple magic. Better days are coming, believe that. Her hand flew to her mouth. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The cafe around them blurred. She saw the rain from 4 years ago instead. The boy with wet hair and empty pockets, his eyes filled with the same exhausted panic she'd grown used to seeing in the mirror. "You," her voice broke, "you were that kid?" He smiled softly. "I was 22 and thought the world was over," he said. "Evicted, broke, scholarship gone, family 2 states away, and barely holding themselves together. I walked into that cafe because it was warm and I needed somewhere to exist for a few minutes without falling apart." His fingers brushed the edge of the card. "You made me a cappuccino I couldn't pay for, and you gave me this." Mara's eyes stung. "I didn't think anyone would remember," she whispered. "I did." He leaned back slightly, eyes drifting to Rosie before returning to her. "I carried it through job interviews, nights on friends' couches, weekends where instant noodles were a luxury. Every time I felt like giving up, I would take this out and stare at it until I could breathe again." He glanced around the cafe, then back at her, his voice softer. "I told myself that if I ever got the chance to be that kind of person for someone else, I wouldn't waste it." The words settled over her like a blanket she wasn't sure she deserved. Shame burned in her throat. "I didn't steal because I wanted to," she murmured, staring at the table. I ran out of ways to be a decent person and still keep her fed." "I know," he said. And somehow it felt like he did. She swallowed hard, the story rising in her whether she wanted it to or not. She told him about Derek, not all at once, not in a neat timeline, but in scattered fragments that slipped out between breaths. How he'd seemed gentle at first, opening doors, kissing her forehead, promising they'd build a life better than the one either of them had been born into. How the drinking had started slowly. How apologies had always come with flowers and a trembling voice. How love had gotten tangled up with fear until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. She talked about the night he'd left, the bills he hadn't paid, the jobs she couldn't keep because daycare cost more than she made, and Rosie always seemed to catch whatever bug was going around. She described the final eviction notice, the way the door had shut behind them and suddenly the car had become the only roof they had left. She skimmed over the worst parts. The nights she hadn't eaten. The times she'd pretended to be full so Rosie wouldn't notice. The way strangers looked at her in parking lots, like she'd chosen this. "And tonight," she finished, voice frayed, "I stood in front of that shelf and realized I had nothing left to sell, nothing left to pawn, nothing left to bargain with. Just my pride, and pride doesn't mix into a bottle." Caleb nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "You shouldn't have had to choose between dignity and feeding your child," he said quietly. "No one should." He glanced out the window where the rain had turned to a fine mist. "There's a shelter on the other side of the river," he continued. "It's quiet, safe, clean. They've got cribs, meals, women who've been where you are and made it out. It's run by a foundation my company funds. Mara blinked. Your company? He hesitated, almost apologetic. I'm the CEO of Rivers and Hale, he said. We build customer support software. Not exactly glamorous, but it pays for milk and cribs when we get it right. She stared at him, mind reeling. The boy she'd once handed a free coffee had turned into the man standing between her and free fall. I don't want to drag you into my mess, she whispered. He met her eyes, steady and unflinching. You didn't, he said, sigh. You stepped into my life years ago on a rainy morning with a cup of coffee and 4 words. Let me return the favor with a roof and a door that locks. Outside, the wind eased. For the first time in a long time, the idea of walking towards something instead of away from it didn't feel impossible. The shelter sat at the edge of the city, where the glass towers gave way to brick buildings and old trees clinging stubbornly to the sidewalk. By the time the rideshare pulled up, the night had softened into a damp gray, the rain now a tired drizzle. A small sign above the entrance read Harbor House. Warm light spilled from the lobby windows, and a few potted plants flanked the door, their leaves glossy and well-kept. It didn't look like the kind of place Mara had imagined shelters to be. It looked cared for. Caleb paid the driver before she could protest. When she stepped out, her knees felt weak, partly from exhaustion, partly from the terrifying possibility that this might actually be safe. Inside, muted yellow lights glowed against cream-colored walls. A woman at the front desk looked up with soft, alert eyes. Her name tag read June. She wore a cardigan, her hair pulled back, and her smile was small but real. This must be the mom you called about, she said to Caleb. Mara's head snapped toward him. You called ahead? I didn't want them to turn you away if they were full, he said, almost sheepish. They saved you a room. June used words like intake and temporary stay and caseworker, but her tone was more like a neighbor than a bureaucrat. She asked gentle questions, names, allergies, whether there was anyone who might show up at the door and cause trouble. When she mentioned restraining orders, Mara's throat tightened. She shook her head, ashamed. Okay, June said simply, we'll still keep an eye out. You're not alone here. The room they were given was small, but to Mara, it might as well have been a palace. 2 narrow beds neatly made. A crib in the corner already prepared with clean sheets. A dresser whose drawers didn't stick. Towels folded at the foot of each bed. Someone had even tucked a small stuffed rabbit into the crib. Mara stood in the doorway, unable to make herself step in. Her body buzzed with disbelief. This is for us? It's yours for now, June said. Lock on the door works. Quiet hours start at 10. Breakfast at 7. If you need anything, staff is on duty all night. Rosie was already half asleep, her head heavy on Mara's shoulder. Gently, with hands that shook for a whole new set of reasons, Mara laid her daughter in the crib. Rosie stirred, sighed, and kept sleeping. Mara brushed hair from her little girl's forehead and felt something she didn't recognize at first. It took a moment to name it. Relief. Thin and fragile, but there. Caleb lingered near the door, leaning one shoulder against the frame as if he didn't want to intrude on the moment. I'll check in tomorrow, he said, yay. No pressure, no expectations. Just to see how you're doing. She turned to him, words tangling on her tongue. Why? She asked finally. It wasn't accusatory, just bewildered. Why go this far for someone you barely know? He exhaled slowly, gaze drifting toward the crib. Because someone once did the same for me, he said. And because you're not someone I barely know. I've been carrying your handwriting in my pocket for 4 years. Her eyes burned. I don't know how to repay you. He shook his head. You don't. This isn't a transaction. He hesitated, then added, but if you want to talk about work sometime, my company has a new role in customer support. You're good with people. You see them. That's rare. Fear flared up in her chest. I haven't worked in years, she protested. Not officially. No degree, no references, no neat story to tell in an interview. You kept people coming back for coffee in a city full of cafes, he countered. You calmed down strangers with nothing but a smile and a paper cup. That's more valuable than half the bullet points on most resumes I see. Mara lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, suddenly so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. The idea of an office, of coworkers, of fluorescent lights and ringing phones felt overwhelming. And yet, buried beneath the fear, something else stirred. A faint, flickering possibility. Sleep, Caleb said softly, reading the exhaustion on her face. We can talk about everything else later. one step at a time. He started to leave, then paused, his hand on the doorframe. "Mara?" She looked up. "You did nothing tonight that makes you less worthy of kindness," he said quietly. "You were just trying to keep your child from going hungry. That doesn't make you a thief in my book. It makes you a mother." When the door closed behind him, she listened for the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall, then finally lay back on the bed. For the first time in months, she didn't have to keep one ear open for knocks on a car window. She didn't have to calculate how many ounces of formula she could stretch into a day. She didn't have to pretend she wasn't afraid. Sleep came slowly, but when it finally took her, it was the closest thing to rest she'd had in a very long time. Morning at Harbor House didn't feel like waking up in an institution. It felt like waking up in the spare room of a house that belonged to a friend you didn't quite know yet. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and toast. Somewhere, a child giggled. Water rushed through pipes in the walls. Doors opened and closed softly. Mara blinked herself awake, disoriented for a second. The ceiling above her wasn't the stained fabric of her car's interior. The light sneaking past the curtains wasn't from a parking lot lamppost. For a moment, panic gripped her. Then she heard Rosie's breathing from the crib, and it gentled her back into the present. By the time she made it to the small communal kitchen, Rosie on her hip, the tables were scattered with women in various stages of exhaustion and recovery. Some hunched over mugs, others coaxed bites of cereal into sleepy toddlers. No one stared. A few offered shy nods, the kind of acknowledgement that said, "We've been where you are." Caleb kept his word. He showed up that afternoon, and the next, and the next. He never arrived empty-handed, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with children's books from a thrift store, sometimes with nothing more than a paper cup of decent coffee and 20 quiet minutes to sit across from her and ask how she was really doing. He didn't pry into details she wasn't ready to share. He didn't insist on gratitude. He didn't wear his kindness like a badge. It was just what he did, showing up again and again until his presence stopped feeling like an interruption and started feeling like a steady part of the week. When he brought up the job again, 2 weeks later, she didn't immediately shut down. "We've got an opening on our customer care team," he said one afternoon, Rosie gumming the edge of a plastic ring on the floor between them. "It's part-time to start, training included, flexible hours." Mara twisted her fingers together. "What if I mess it up?" He shrugged lightly. "Then you'll mess it up like everyone else does at some point, and we'll teach you how to fix it. That's what training is for." "I don't have a degree," she reminded him. "I flunked out of my first year of college," he countered. "Failure isn't a permanent status, it's just a chapter." June encouraged her, too. "You can't stay here forever," she said kindly. "And you shouldn't have to. This place is a bridge, not an island." So, one trembling Tuesday, Mara found herself standing in the lobby of Rivers and Hale, clutching a borrowed blazer and a folder that contained the barest excuse for a resume. The building's glass exterior reflected a city she still didn't fully trust, but the receptionist's warm greeting calmed her just enough to step inside. The training was overwhelming at first. Software screens, scripts, acronyms, headsets, but there was a rhythm to it she began to recognize. Listen. Acknowledge, reassure, solve what you can. Treat the person on the other end of the line like they're more than a problem to fix. That part she knew how to do. She'd been doing it with espresso and paper cups for years. 2 months later, she had a badge with her name on it, a paycheck that didn't bounce, and a routine that anchored her days. She could buy Rosie clothes that fit. She could choose fruit at the grocery store without mentally calculating how many meals it would cost her later. She could breathe. But good things, she had learned, were fragile. It started with whispers. A conversation that fell silent when she walked into the break room. A pair of colleagues who exchanged looks and moved a little farther away at lunch. A joke that died half-finished when she appeared at the end of a hallway. She brushed it off at first. Her mind was loud enough with old fears. She didn't have room for new ones. But fragments floated back to her as the days went on, phrases caught at the edge of hearing. Stayed in a shelter. Her ex has a record. He hired her personally, you know. Someone, somewhere, had put the pieces together. Her past wasn't just hers anymore. It had become office lore, warped and stretched into a story she'd never agreed to tell. One evening, long after most people had gone home, she sat alone in the break room, staring at a mug of tea gone cold. The cursor blinked accusingly on the open resignation letter on her phone. Maybe they're right, she thought. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe this was all just a temporary kindness, a mistake that needs correcting. She saved the draft but didn't send it, not yet. The next morning at 8:22 a.m., every inbox at Rivers and Hale pinged at once. Subject, a story you should know. The email was short. No corporate jargon, no bullet points, no links to resources or policy updates, just a story. Mara read it at her desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard, heart pounding harder with each line. Years ago, Caleb, she corrected herself, even in her thoughts, wrote, he had walked into a cafe in the middle of a storm, broke and humiliated. Sure, his life had derailed for good. A stranger behind the counter had made him a coffee he couldn't afford and slipped a note beneath the cup. She didn't ask my name, the email read. She didn't give me a lecture. She didn't demand anything in return. She just looked at me like I wasn't a lost cause and wrote 4 words that I've carried in my wallet every day since. Better days are coming. He went on to explain how that moment had anchored him through nights of doubt and years of hard work. How he'd promised himself that if he was ever in a position to offer someone the same lifeline, he would. That woman works here now, he continued. She answers your calls, helps your customers, and carries more resilience and empathy in her than most of us could understand. Some of you have heard pieces of her story. Some of those pieces have been twisted, stretched, or shared without her permission. Then in a line that made Mara's throat close, he wrote, she is not defined by her worst days or by the choices poverty cornered her into making. She is defined by how far she's come, by the daughter she fights for, and by the compassion she brings into this building every single day. We don't build a great company by rewarding perfection. We build it by standing beside people who get back up. He ended it simply. If you're going to talk about her, talk about that. Mara stared at the screen until the words blurred. Her first instinct was to disappear, to pack her things and slip out before anyone could walk past her desk and connect the dots. But as the day unfolded, something unexpected happened. An email popped up from Jonah, a coworker who usually kept his distance. Hey, Mara, I owe you an apology. I've been listening to rumors instead of getting to know the person who sits 10 feet away from me. That email made me realize how quickly I judge people I don't understand. If you're open to it, I'd like to start over. Others followed. Short notes, a quiet, I'm sorry in the hallway. A cup of coffee left on her desk with a post-it that simply read, glad you're here. Not everyone changed. Some still kept their distance. But enough did that the floor beneath her feet started to feel a little more solid. 2 days later, HR asked if she would consider speaking at a small workshop on customer empathy. The idea of standing in front of her coworkers made her palms sweat. Every instinct told her she wasn't polished enough, not put together enough, not enough. But that night, sitting on her bed at Harbor House while Rosie slept, she thought about the countless times she'd felt invisible. The way it felt to have people talk over her, around her, never to her. The way a single kind sentence from a stranger had once kept her breathing when everything else felt pointless. Maybe, she thought, someone needed to hear from a person who'd been on the other side of the phone, crying in a parking lot or huddled in a car, or standing in a grocery aisle with an impossible choice in their hands. The next week, she stood in a small conference room, 20 faces turned toward her. Her hands shook. Her throat felt tight, but when she started speaking, the words came anyway. She didn't give them statistics. She gave them memories, the feeling of being treated like a problem, the way fear could make a person sound angry when really they were just terrified, the way a simple I hear you could pull someone back from the edge. She didn't tell them every detail of her life. She didn't have to. What she did share was honest and raw and deeply human. When she finished, the room fell silent for a moment. Then, slowly, people began to stand. Not because anyone had told them to, but because something in them recognized the weight of what she'd given. Afterwards, a woman from HR approached her. That was the most powerful thing I've heard in a long time, she said. Her voice wasn't polished the way it usually was in meetings. It was soft. Real. Walking back to her desk, Mara realized something had shifted. The building was the same. The work was the same, but she no longer felt like a guest who might be asked to leave at any moment. For the first time, she felt like she was part of the story being written here, not just a footnote. She still jumped at loud noises. She still flinched when unknown numbers called her phone at night. But a new thought had begun to take root beneath the old fears. Maybe the worst chapters of her life weren't the last ones. She didn't know yet that another storm was already building, one that would drag her past back into the present with a violence she'd tried to outrun. It arrived on a Tuesday. Tuesday had become laundry day at the Women's Center attached to Harbor House. The hum of old washing machines filled the narrow room with a kind of steady white noise. It was one of the few tasks that quieted Mara's mind. Sorting clothes, folding, stacking, simple movements that gave her hands something to do when her thoughts got too loud. Rosie was down the hall in the playroom, her laughter occasionally cutting through the background chatter. Staff members moved in and out, offering extra detergent or stories about their weekends. Mara had just folded a tiny pair of leggings when a voice detonated the calm. "There you are." The word sliced through the air from the doorway. Rough, slurred at the edges, too familiar. Mara's entire body locked. She turned slowly, a cold heaviness sinking into her stomach. Derek stood there, leaning on the doorframe like he owned the place. His hair was longer, unwashed, his clothes hanging off a thinner frame. The anger in his eyes, though, that was exactly the same. "I've been looking all over this damn city for you," he said, raising his voice so it bounced off the tiled walls. "Thought you could just run off with my kid and shack up with some rich guy." Conversations in the hallway stopped. A staff member glanced up from a clipboard, expression sharpening. Somewhere down the corridor, a child started crying. "Derek," Mara said quietly, her throat so tight the words scraped on the way out. "This isn't the place. Please, you need to leave." He pushed off the doorframe, taking a step into the room. The tang of alcohol reached her before he did. "I'm her father," he snarled. "I have a right to see my own daughter." Fear lanced through her, hot and electric. She imagined Rosie's small body stiffening at the sound of his voice. She pictured the staff asking her to leave for causing trouble, the court siding with him because he shouted louder, the fragile stability she'd built crumbling under his rage. One of the center employees approached cautiously. "Sir, you can't be here without permission. I'm going to have to ask you—" "Back off," he snapped, pointing a finger at her without even looking. "This is between me and my family." Mara's hands were shaking so badly she had to press them flat against the laundry table to hide it. "You lost the right to call us that when you walked out," she whispered. "Please, you're scaring people." A familiar voice, calm but edged with steel, cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Caleb stepped into the doorway, not rushed, not theatrical. He simply placed himself between Derek and the rest of the room, his presence like someone closing a door gently but firmly. Derek eyed him up and down, lip curling. "And who the hell are you?" "I'm the person asking you to leave," Caleb replied quietly. "You're trespassing. Security has already been called." Mara realized Caleb must have been meeting with the center director. His visits here had become more frequent as his company deepened its support of Harbor House. Somehow, he always seemed to be nearby when things tilted. Derek laughed, but it was hollow. "You think you can take my daughter from me? Play hero, throw money around, and suddenly you're daddy of the year?" Caleb didn't rise to the bait. "No one is taking anything from you right now," he said, voice steady. "What's happening is that you're frightening residents in a safe space. That ends here." Derek lunged, his hand jerking forward as if to shove past him. It happened fast, but not fast enough to catch Caleb off guard. He stepped sideways, not striking back, just blocking, using his body as a shield. Within seconds, 2 security guards and another staff member appeared, voices firm but controlled. The hallway filled with movement. Children were ushered into side rooms. Doors closed. Someone called the police. Derek's curses echoed down the corridor as he was escorted out, words no child should ever hear. When the door finally slammed behind him and the echoes faded, Mara's knees gave out. She sank to the floor, the folded laundry toppling beside her. Caleb was there in an instant, kneeling, his arms wrapping around her in an embrace that was more anchor than comfort. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her body shook with the force of silent sobs, the kind that came from somewhere too deep for sound. "You're safe," he murmured into her hair. "He's not getting anywhere near you or Rosie, I promise." Later that evening, he drove her and Rosie to his office after hours. The lobby was dim, the building hollow without its usual buzz. He made her tea in the staff kitchen, set it in front of her, and didn't push when she just cupped the mug without drinking. Then he made a phone call. "Mateo," he said when the other person picked up. "I'm calling in that favor." The man on the other end was a family lawyer, his voice warm but sharp. Caleb explained what had happened, the history of Derek's absence, his outburst at the center, the years of instability. "I owe you one," Mateo said. "Yell, send me the details, I'll take the case. No fees." After he hung up, Caleb turned to her. "He's one of the best family lawyers in the state," he said. "I helped him through a rough season years ago. He's been waiting for a chance to pay it forward." Tears blurred her vision. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. It was the refrain that lived at the back of her mind, resurfacing every time something good happened. Caleb took her hand, his grip firm and gentle all at once. "You deserve safety," he said. "You deserve not to wake up every day wondering when the past will kick down your door. You're not alone in this anymore, Mara. Not with the law, not with me." The custody hearing didn't stretch on for months the way she'd feared. Derek's record, his outburst at the center, and the documented years of abandonment painted a picture the judge couldn't ignore. When the final ruling came, granting her full custody of Rosie, she sat on the courthouse steps afterward, the official papers clutched in one hand, Rosie's warm fingers woven through the other. The sky above the city was clear for once. The air felt lighter, or maybe that was just the absence of a weight she'd carried for too long. Freedom, she realized, wasn't always fireworks and loud celebrations. Sometimes it was a quiet exhale on stone steps, a small child humming beside you, and the knowledge that one door had finally closed for good. A year didn't fix everything, but it softened the edges. Mara moved from Harbor House into a small apartment with peeling paint and creaky floors. The kind of place she'd once turned her nose up at and now cherished. There was space for a second-hand couch, a kitchen table with mismatched chairs, and a corner where Rosie's toys spilled out of a fabric bin like bright fragments of a childhood that finally had room to grow. At work, her role shifted from answering calls to training others how to do it. She became the manager of the customer care team almost quietly, as if the promotion had simply grown around her. Her co-workers looked to her when difficult cases came in, trusting her to find the words that could bring a furious caller back to something gentler than rage. "You translate pain," one teammate told her once, after listening to her de-escalate a particularly tense call. "You hear what they're not saying." Maybe that was because she knew what it was like to call from the edge, hoping someone on the other end would see her as more than a problem to resolve. Caleb still visited often. Officially, he'd drop by to check in on team metrics or bring updated reports. Unofficially, he came because Rosie had started squealing his name the moment she heard his footsteps in the hall. "Uncle Caleb!" she'd cry, barreling into him with the kind of trust only children and very brave adults can muster. He'd scoop her up, let her tug on his tie, sit cross-legged on the office floor with her to color while Mara finished an email. He never pushed their relationship into something it wasn't ready to be. He didn't shower her with grand romantic gestures or dramatic declarations. Instead, he did small things consistently, saving her a seat at meetings, walking her to the bus stop when it was dark, staying late to wash mugs after team gatherings. Still, shadows clung to her in quiet moments. Guilt whispered that she hadn't earned this new life. Shame reminded her of the night in the convenience store, of Derek's shouted words. Fear suggested that at any moment someone would decide they'd all made a mistake in letting her in. Hope and doubt existed side by side in her, like roommates who hadn't learned how to share a kitchen. Then one evening, Rosie's fever spiked. At first, it was just a flushed face and an unusual quiet. By nightfall, her skin was hot to the touch, her breathing shallow and fast. Panic rose in Mara's chest, thick, suffocating, tangled with memories of nights spent in ER waiting rooms before she'd had insurance, before she'd had a stable address to write on forms. She rushed to the hospital, heart hammering as she moved through the bright chaos of triage, nurses' questions flying past her in a blur. "Recent illnesses? Any allergies? Onset of fever?" She answered automatically, her voice sounding far away in her own ears. Once they were settled in a small curtained room, monitors beeping softly around them, time lost its shape. Nurses came and went, adjusting IVs, checking vitals, offering practiced reassurances. Rosie whimpered against her chest, her cheeks flushed, her hair damp with sweat. Mara didn't call Caleb. She told herself he'd done enough, that it was late, that she shouldn't rely on him for everything. Underneath all that, a quieter fear whispered. If she leaned too hard, he might step back. He showed up anyway. Just past midnight, the curtain rustled, and there he was, hair mussed, shirt half untucked, a paper bag of snacks in one hand and a small stuffed bear in the other. "How did you—" she started. June texted me, he said, yeah. She heard you'd taken Rosie in. I came as fast as I could. He didn't ask permission to stay. He just sank into the plastic chair beside her and settled in like he was prepared to be there as long as it took. Hours blurred. At some point, exhaustion dragged her under for a brief, fitful doze, Rosie still nestled against her. When she stirred awake, the room was dim, lit only by the glow from the hallway. Rosie murmured in her sleep, her tiny voice cracking the silence. "Don't let Mommy cry again," she whispered, the words slurred but heartbreakingly clear. Caleb had been sitting across the room, elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. At Rosie's words, he froze. Slowly, he lifted his head, pressing his knuckles against his mouth as if to hold something in. His eyes glistened. Tears tracked silently down his face, cutting lines through the tiredness there. He didn't make a sound, didn't call attention to his grief. It was the kind of crying people do when they care so deeply it leaks out despite their best efforts to stay composed. In that moment, watching him, something shifted inside Mara. This wasn't a man swooping in to rescue a damsel in distress. This was someone whose heart was breaking alongside hers, who wasn't afraid to let the weight of her story touch him. By morning, Rosie's fever had broken. The doctor explained it was a nasty virus, but with fluids and rest, she'd be okay. Relief washed over Mara so intensely her hands shook. As she folded the discharge papers into her bag, she felt something crinkle in her palm. She looked down. A small piece of notepaper had been tucked there, the handwriting unfamiliar. She unfolded it. "I'm not here to rescue you. I just want to walk beside you." See, no promises of forever, no declarations of love, just a quiet, steady offer. "I'm here." She read it again and again on the bus ride home, Rosie asleep against her. The words didn't demand anything. They didn't insist. They simply waited for her heart to decide what to do with them. For the first time, the feeling blooming in her chest wasn't just gratitude. It wasn't indebtedness. It wasn't fear of losing what she'd been given. It was trust. The sign above the cafe door caught the late afternoon light, the painted letters glowing with a gentle warmth. "Third Light," it read. Mara had chosen the name late one night, sitting at her kitchen table with a chipped mug and a blank notebook. The first light, she'd decided, had been that cafe years ago when she'd handed a boy a cup of coffee and a hope she didn't yet know she'd need for herself. The second light had been Harbor House, a place where strangers had become something close to family. This cafe, this space she now stood in the center of, wipes in hand and apron tied around her waist, was the third. A light she'd helped build on purpose this time, not just stumbled into. The place wasn't large, but it felt bigger on the inside than it looked from the street. Exposed brick on one wall held shelves lined with potted plants and dog-eared books. A small corner near the front window had become a reading nook. Beanbags scattered beneath a bulletin board labeled Community Kindness, where customers pinned notes about rides offered, meals shared, and victories celebrated. On another wall, black and white photos of local families hung in mismatched frames. At the back, near the register, a glass jar sat with a handwritten sign, "Pay It Forward Fund, for anyone who needs a warm drink on a cold day." Third Light had been open for just over a year. It existed because Caleb had quietly offered her a loan with interest terms so gentle they felt more like a suggestion than a demand. "Not a gift," he'd insisted when she hesitated. "A partnership. I believe in what you'll create here." He hadn't been wrong. The cafe drew a small but steady stream of regulars. The nurse who worked night shifts at the hospital, the retired teacher who brought a stack of crossword puzzles every Tuesday, the high school student who studied in the corner between shifts at the grocery store. Some came for the coffee. Others came because they'd heard this was the kind of place where you could sit alone and not feel lonely. At a small table near the back, Rosie sat with crayons splayed out in front of her. Her hair was pulled into two uneven pigtails, a bow slightly askew. She hummed softly as she drew, a house with 3 stick figures in front of it and a sun that took up half the sky. Caleb sat beside her, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, watching as she concentrated hard on getting the roof just right. A stack of clean mugs rested on the table beside him. He'd insisted on taking them back to the office dishwasher to save water for the cafe. He'd also fixed the leaky sink in the back and replaced a flickering bulb without being asked. He came almost every day now, sometimes for an espresso, sometimes to drop off paperwork, sometimes with no excuse at all. He'd settle into a corner seat with his laptop, glancing up every so often to watch the door, the customers, the life that pulsed quietly through the cafe. To anyone else, he might have looked like a patron who'd grown fond of a local spot. But Mara knew better. "Uncle Caleb," Rosie said suddenly, tapping her drawing with a purple crayon, "can you come to my school's Daddy Day?" The world held its breath. Mara was wiping down the counter when she heard it. The dish rag stilled in her hand. Her heart did something complicated in her chest, leaping, stuttering, bracing. Caleb blinked. For a heartbeat, he looked younger, like the boy who'd once held a paper cup with shaking hands in a storm. He turned slowly toward Rosie, then lifted his eyes to meet Mara's across the room. She didn't say anything, didn't rush in to rescue him or deflect the question. Her gaze was open, vulnerable, full of the history they shared. Formula and shelter, courtrooms and hospital rooms, emails and scraped-together courage. Her look held a quiet invitation. "A yes if you want it." Caleb swallowed, the movement visible in his throat. Then he smiled, small and sure. "I would be honored," he said, his voice steady. "If it's okay with your mom." Rosie turned to her, eyes wide, cheeks flushed with hope. "Mommy?" Mara's fingers tightened around the dish rag. For a moment, old fears tried to claw their way back. What if it all fell apart? What if she was asking too much of him? What if... Then she remembered the note in her drawer at home. "I'm not here to rescue you. I just want to walk beside you." She took a breath, feeling it all the way down to her toes. "Yeah, baby," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I think that would be wonderful." Rosie squealed, launching herself at Caleb with so much enthusiasm that he nearly tipped backward in his chair. He caught her easily, laughing, the sound bright and unguarded. Outside, the sun dipped lower, turning the windows into sheets of gold. Inside, the cafe buzzed with the low hum of conversation, the hiss of the espresso machine, the squeak of the front door opening and closing as regulars came in for their evening cups. Third Light glowed, not just from the bulbs overhead, but from something deeper. Stories woven into the grain of the tables, second chances poured into ceramic mugs. Quiet promises traded in the space between strangers. Mara watched Caleb and Rosie from behind the counter, her heart full and trembling. The life in front of her wasn't perfect. It carried scars and memories and questions about what came next. But for the first time, she wasn't bracing for everything to be taken away. She was simply here. And that was enough. Closing time had its own kind of peace. The last customer waved goodbye. The bell over the door chimed one final time, and the street outside settled into a softer rhythm. Headlights gliding past, distant laughter drifting from a bar down the block. Mara flipped the sign on the door from "Open" to "See you tomorrow," then pressed her palm briefly against the glass, feeling the cool night on the other side. Inside, Third Light exhaled. Chairs scraped gently as she and Caleb turned them upside down onto tables. The espresso machine let out one last sigh as she cleaned the portafilter. The floor gleamed in patches where the mop had already passed. Rosie, long past her usual bedtime, lay curled on a bench in the corner, a blanket tucked around her, her crayons sprawled across the table beside her latest masterpiece. 3 stick figures again, but this time there were extra details. A tie on one, a string of little hearts above their heads. Caleb carried a tubs of cleaned mugs from the back, setting them carefully on the counter. "Sink's officially leak-free," he said. "Again, but maybe we should budget for a new faucet before this one decides it's had enough of us." Mara smiled, a slow, easy curve that had taken years to learn. "Put it on the list," she replied. "Right under fix the flickering sign letter and teach Rosie not to give away all the cookies to people who look tired." "I'm not sure we want to fix that last one," he said. "It's kind of the whole point of this place." He said it lightly, but they both knew it was true. Third Light existed for the tired, the frayed, the almost broken, the people who needed a soft landing more than they needed a perfect latte. On the wall near the register hung a small frame, its glass slightly scratched. Inside was a worn square of paper, edges frayed from years of being folded and unfolded. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "Better days are coming, believe that." Underneath, in smaller handwriting, another line had been added. "Sometimes you help write them yourself." The note had been Caleb's for years. Now it belonged to the cafe, to the community, to anyone who needed to borrow a little hope for the price of a cup of coffee. Mara stood in front of it for a moment, drying her hands on a towel. She thought of the girl she'd been when she'd written those words the first time, tired but still unbroken, offering hope to strangers without realizing how much she'd need it for herself. She thought of the woman in the convenience store aisle, heart pounding, coat hiding a can of formula she couldn't afford. And she thought of the person she was now, standing in a cafe she co-owned with a man who'd once been a soaking wet boy in a storm, who'd turned his second chance into a bridge for others. Caleb joined her, following her gaze to the frame. "Funny how 4 words can change everything," he said softly. "They didn't change everything," she replied. "They just helped us keep going long enough to see that things could." He nodded, then glanced toward Rosie, who had shifted in her sleep, mumbling something unintelligible. The affection in his eyes was unmistakable. "Daddy Day is next week," he said quietly. "You sure she wants me there and not someone else?" Mara turned to him fully. The question beneath his words was older than their shared history. "Am I allowed to belong here?" "There is no someone else," she said gently. "There's the man who showed up when no one had to, who stood in front of anger and behind our victories, who never once made me feel like I was a project he was trying to fix." She hesitated, then added, "If you want that place in her life, in mine, it's already yours." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't the tense, aching kind that had once filled her nights. It was soft, waiting, full of possibility. Caleb reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers before closing around them. The touch wasn't a grand gesture. It was simple, steady, rooted in years of walking beside each other through storms and slow mornings and everything in between. Outside, the streetlights flickered on fully. Inside, they stood among upside-down chairs and the faint scent of coffee, 2 people who had once been strangers missing wallets and losing homes, now holding on to something that felt a lot like a future. For the insomniacs of the world, for the ones lying awake in dark rooms, wondering if their worst moments are all anyone will ever see, Mara wished she could bottle this feeling and pour it into their hands. The knowledge that one kind act in a cafe can echo across years, that one night in a shelter can lead to a doorway of your own. That one person standing beside you in your fear can become a family you never thought you'd have the courage to choose. Later, when the lights were off and the cafe was locked, the sign above the door still glowed faintly in the reflected city light. Third light. Not the first chance, not even the second. The one that comes after you've already fallen apart and put yourself back together wrong a few times. The one that says, you're still allowed to try again. On the wall inside, behind the darkened glass, those 4 words waited for whoever would need them next. Better days are coming, believe that. And this time, Mara did.